that vitamin D regulates is the gene called tryptophan hydroxylase. Tryptophan hydroxylase is important because it converts the essential amino acid tryptophan into serotonin. And what my research identified is actually vitamin D is regulating. Humans have two forms, have two separate tryptophan hydroxylase enzymes. We have one in the brain and we have one in the gut and also in our immune cells. And what I found is that the sequence itself in this gene, one sequence was actually associated with activation and one sequence was associated with deactivation. So vitamin D is actually regulating these two genes that are important to make serotonin. It's regulating them in opposite directions. So it's turning one on and it's turning the other off. So the one gene is in the gut. So we have a tryptophan hydroxylase in our gut. And actually around 90% of the serotonin that we make in our body happens in our gut. So most of the serotonin in our body is actually made in the gut. The serotonin made in the gut does not actually cross over the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. It can't get into the brain. Tryptophan can get into the brain and be converted into serotonin, but that's done by the other enzyme. So in the gut, tryptophan hydroxylase 1 converts tryptophan into serotonin. And this is important because your platelets can't make serotonin, but they need it because serotonin is what causes your platelets to coagulate when you have an injury. It causes your platelets to clot together. So the serotonin made in your gut has a very important function, and that function is to give it to your platelets so that they can clot when you have an injury. However, too much serotonin in the gut also causes inflammation because it activates T cells. So if you have too much serotonin in the gut, it can also cause GI inflammation, gut distress, and this has been shown in several different studies. Well, I found that vitamin D has this gene has a vitamin D sequence that vitamin D recognizes that turns it down, turns it off, so it's not as active. There's another gene, tryptophan hydroxylase gene, in the brain, and this gene is responsible for converting serotonin in your brain, which is what most of you are probably familiar with. Serotonin in your brain is important for mood. It's important for a lot of functions we'll talk about in a minute. But what I found is that vitamin D actually turns on this gene and makes it active so that it converts tryptophan into serotonin. So I started to put these pieces together. It had been known that vitamin D deficiency was associated to autism. It also had been known that serotonin deficiency was linked to autism, but no one had sort of put these two together. So I started to realize that once I found vitamin D was regulating serotonin, that this may explain some of the characteristics associated with autism. For example, it can explain the low association to vitamin D. It can explain how autistics have low serotonin in the brain, but they have high serotonin levels in the gut. It can also explain the high male prevalence of autism. So males are about 5 times more likely to get autism than females. And also it can explain the presence of autoimmune antibodies in mothers of autistics' blood. So as vitamin D levels have been decreasing over the past few decades, autism levels have been increasing. In fact, there's been about a 600% increase in autism since the 1970s. And genetics only accounts for a small percentage. In fact, over 70% of all autistic cases cannot be linked to a genetic cause. Now, increased autism awareness obviously plays an important role for increased diagnosis of autism. But there has to be some other underlying mechanism. So as vitamin D sufficiency has gone down, autism incidence has actually increased. As I mentioned, vitamin D regulates the gene that makes serotonin in the brain from tryptophan. So you guys probably are familiar with serotonin and how serotonin is important for mood, but also serotonin plays a very, very important role during early brain development. It's actually called a brain morphogen because during early fetal brain development, serotonin shapes the structure and the wiring of the developing brain. Serotonin tells the neurons where to go and what types of neurons to become. And in fact, in mice, when you get rid of the ability to make serotonin in the developing brain, it causes abnormal wiring and structure of the brain, and it leads to abnormal behaviors, which are considered autistic-like behaviors in animals. So serotonin plays a very important role in brain development. So this is where I published a paper on how vitamin D hormone regulates the production of serotonin and how this may relate to autism. Because this gene is important to make serotonin, and there was another paper that was published shortly after that validated my paper and did show biochemically vitamin D does actually increase tryptophan hydroxylase 2 in neurons, and so it is regulating the production of serotonin. So how does this relate to the male prevalence? Well, as I mentioned, males are 5 times more likely to get autism. Well, estrogen actually activates the same gene, tryptophan hydroxylase 2, in the brain that vitamin D does. Actually, it can increase it by like almost tenfold, which is quite a bit. So how does this relate to autism? Well, sex hormones aren't made, you don't make sex hormones during fetal development, but it has been shown, for example, like the amniotic fluid of a female fetus has higher levels of estrogen than of a male fetus, and then immediately after birth, so neonates, females have much higher levels of estrogen in the frontal cortex. So it's possible if you have a mother that was deficient in vitamin D, if it was a female fetus, maybe it was protected from that vitamin D deficiency because estrogen was able to sort of rescue that phenotype by activating the same gene that vitamin D activates. I also think it explains how the autoimmune related, how autoimmunity is related to autism. So we know that low maternal vitamin D levels, so we know that mothers of autistic children have these autoantibodies in their blood that are against fetal brain proteins. In fact, they're 3 times more likely to have these antibodies in their blood that are against fetal brain proteins. What is that doing there? You're not supposed to have antibodies in your bloodstream against brain proteins. And there was a group at UC Davis that showed if you take monkeys and you cause them to have an autoimmune response, those pregnant monkeys will have a strong autoimmune response, and the antibodies will cross into the fetal brain and will cause abnormal brain development. So how does this relate to vitamin D? Well, I mentioned there's 2 different genes involved in making serotonin. One gene, the tryptophan hydroxylase 1, is the one that vitamin D actually turns off. It turns it down. Well, tryptophan can be converted into serotonin, and this can happen in your gut and also in your placenta. The placenta tissue also has this enzyme. So if you're converting all the tryptophan into serotonin, it's not able to go into this other pathway, which also can convert tryptophan into something called kynurenine, which is very important to make a certain type of immune cell called T regulatory cells. T regulatory cells are very important for preventing an autoimmune response. In fact, in mice, if you get rid of the ability to make kynurenine, the pregnant mice have such a strong autoimmune response that the fetus is aborted. So it's too strong. So it's been shown that this is very, very important for preventing autoimmunity, specifically during pregnancy. So what we think happens is that under conditions of low vitamin D, the tryptophan is being sucked into this pathway to make serotonin in the placenta. And the reason for that is because tryptophan binds much more tightly to tryptophan hydroxylase than it does to the other enzyme, IDO. So it's kind of acting as a sink for the tryptophan. It's syncing up all the tryptophan to be converted into serotonin and not leaving enough tryptophan to be converted into kynurenine, and therefore T regulatory cells go down when you don't have enough T regulatory cells during embryonic development, which, by the way, is you have a foreign thing in your body. So the mother's immune system is going, whoa, what's this? What's this here? And it starts to mount an immune response. We think that it's possible that the immune response could then affect the fetal brain development and lead to abnormal fetal brain development. So I think this has a big take home for prevention of autism specifically. That is, have a woman who is going to conceive or a woman who is pregnant, get her vitamin D levels measured. Make sure she has adequate levels of vitamin D and supplement accordingly. We know that around 1,000 IUs can raise blood serum levels of vitamin D by about 5 nanograms per milliliter. So if you have a mother that has levels of 20 nanograms per mil, if you want to bring her up to 30, she's actually going to need around 4,000 IUs a day. So I think that's a pretty easy take-home. Vitamin D supplements are cheap. They're almost a penny a pill. So there's really, no reason why people should be deficient in vitamin D. That's my 2 cents. But if we're going to talk about serotonin, there's another micronutrient we need to consider, and that is the marine omega-3 fatty acids, eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, so EPA and DHA. Leading up to my second publication, I began to ask myself, why do